The morning sun cast long shadows across the corporate headquarters of Meridian Industries, where thousands of employees shuffled through glass doors like cattle being herded to slaughter. Among them walked Marcus Chan, his leather briefcase cutting through the crowd with the same precision that would soon define his entire existence. For 28 years, he had been one of them, another face in the endless stream of the compliant, the comfortable, the conquered. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was a symphony of mundane conversations about weekend plans and weather forecasts. Marcus stood in the corner, observing the herd mentality that governed every interaction. Janet from accounting worried aloud about her daughter's soccer practice conflicting with her book club meeting. David from marketing nervously adjusted his tie while rehearsing his presentation to himself. These people lived in cages of their own making, and they had grown so accustomed to the bars that they no longer saw them. The revelation that would transform Marcus's understanding of power dynamics came not through some dramatic epiphany, but through a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning meeting. The conference room buzzed with the familiar energy of middle management anxiety as Vice President Sarah Wellington entered, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. She didn't raise her voice or make grandiose gestures. Instead, she spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that true power whispers while weakness shouts. The Henderson account, she began, her eyes scanning the room like a predator assessing potential threats, represents more than just a revenue opportunity. It represents the difference between those who shape reality and those who merely react to it. Her words hung in the air while the assembled managers nodded with the enthusiastic agreement of people desperate to be seen as aligned with authority. Marcus watched this display of hierarchical theater with growing fascination. He observed how Tom Rodriguez, who moments earlier had been confidently discussing his innovative marketing strategy, suddenly deflated when Sarah's gaze settled on him with mild disapproval. The man who had built a reputation as a creative force in the department transformed instantly into an apologetic subordinate, explaining away his ideas as mere suggestions rather than convictions. This moment crystallized something that had been growing in Marcus's consciousness for months. The corporate world, like every other human ecosystem, operated on the fundamental principle of predator and prey. The sheep, and they were sheep, moved in herds, seeking safety in numbers and comfort in conformity. They made decisions based on consensus rather than conviction, avoided conflict at all costs, and measured success by their ability to blend seamlessly into the acceptable patterns of behavior established by others. But the wolves understood something different entirely. They recognized that leadership was not about being liked or approved of, it was about the strategic application of will. Sarah Wellington had not achieved her position by seeking validation from her peers or subordinates. She had ascended by understanding that most people desperately wanted to be led, even as they complained about leadership. They craved the relief that came from having someone else make the difficult decisions, take the risks, and bear the responsibility for outcomes. The transformation of Marcus's mindset did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process of unlearning the social conditioning that had taught him to value harmony over progress, agreement over truth, and acceptance over achievement. He began to study the subtle dynamics of power that played out in every interaction, from the way people positioned themselves in meetings to the language they used when discussing challenges and opportunities. He noticed how the sheep always spoke in terms of limitations. We can't do that because the client won't accept. Management would never approve. Their default mode was to identify obstacles rather than solutions, to seek permission rather than forgiveness, and to wait for others to create the conditions they claimed to want rather than creating those conditions themselves. The wolves, by contrast, operated from a fundamentally different paradigm. They spoke in terms of possibilities. When faced with a challenge, their first instinct was not to explain why something couldn't be done, but to determine how it could be accomplished. They understood that in most situations, the person who acted with conviction and clarity would shape the outcome, regardless of their formal position in the hierarchy. This insight led Marcus to experiment with small applications of wolf psychology in his daily interactions. During a heated debate about budget allocations for the upcoming quarter, instead of waiting for the meeting to reach consensus through the usual process of lengthy discussion and compromise, he presented a clear, well-reasoned proposal and, then, sat back in silence. The room, accustomed to endless back-and-forth negotiation, didn't know how to respond to someone who simply stated their position without defensiveness or desperate attempts to win approval. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in the context of a corporate meeting. Finally, Jennifer Walsh, the department head, nodded slowly and said, "That's actually quite reasonable. Let's move forward with Marcus's framework." The other managers, who had been prepared to spend the next hour debating minor details, simply accepted this direction and moved on to the next agenda item. This experience revealed a fundamental truth about human psychology that most people never recognize. The majority of individuals are far more comfortable following clear direction than participating in democratic decision-making processes. Democracy, while valuable in political contexts, becomes a tool of inefficiency in most practical situations where decisive action is required. The sheep gathered in groups not because group decision-making produced superior outcomes, but because it diffused responsibility and provided emotional comfort. Marcus began to understand that his previous approach to professional relationships had been fundamentally flawed. He had been seeking to be liked, respected, and included, goals that inevitably led to compromise, mediocrity, and dependence on others' approval. The wolf mindset required abandoning these needs in favor of a more fundamental objective: effectiveness. This shift in perspective affected every aspect of his behavior. In negotiations, instead of beginning with concessions designed to demonstrate goodwill, he started by clearly articulating his position and, then, waiting for the other party to respond. In project meetings, rather than contributing to every discussion in order to appear engaged, he spoke only when he had something substantive to add, allowing his words to carry greater weight through scarcity. The results were immediate and remarkable. Colleagues who had previously seen him as a competent but unremarkable team player began seeking his input on important decisions. His supervisor, Robert Kim, started assigning him to higher-profile projects and including him in strategic planning sessions that were typically reserved for senior staff. But the most significant change was internal. Marcus discovered that by refusing to participate in the emotional labor of constantly managing others' feelings and expectations, he had freed tremendous mental and emotional energy for more productive purposes. The sheep exhausted themselves in endless cycles of worry about what others thought, whether they were being included, and how their actions might be perceived. The wolf simply focused on results. This liberation came with its own challenges. Some colleagues interpreted his new approach as arrogance or aloofness. Sarah Peterson from Human Resources made several passive-aggressive comments about team players and collaborative spirit during all-hands meetings, clearly directed at what she perceived as Marcus's increasing independence. Rather than responding defensively or attempting to repair these relationships through appeasement, Marcus applied another principle of wolf psychology: the strategic use of indifference. He neither confirmed nor denied others' interpretations of his behavior. He simply continued to focus on producing exceptional work and achieving measurable results. Over time, the quality of his output spoke louder than any personality conflicts or social friction. This approach required developing what Marcus came to think of as emotional sovereignty, the ability to remain centered and focused regardless of others' reactions, opinions, or attempts to manipulate through guilt, anger, or social pressure. The sheep were constantly buffeted by the emotional weather created by others because they had never learned to generate their own internal climate. The wolf understood that emotions, while important sources of information, were terrible masters. Decisions made from emotional reactivity rarely produced optimal outcomes. Instead, the wolf cultivated the ability to acknowledge emotions without being controlled by them, to use feelings as data rather than directives. This skill proved invaluable when Marcus was assigned to lead the turnaround of a failing product line that had been hemorrhaging money for 18 months. The previous team leader, Michael Torres, had approached the challenge by trying to maintain morale through optimistic messaging and team-building exercises while avoiding the difficult conversations about performance and accountability that the situation demanded. Marcus's first action was to conduct individual meetings with each team member to assess their capabilities, commitment, and willingness to participate in the intensive effort required for a successful turnaround. These conversations were direct and honest in a way that violated every norm of corporate diplomatic communication. "Jennifer," he said to the product manager who had been with the project since its inception, "I've reviewed the performance metrics for the past 6 quarters, and I need to understand your perspective on why we've consistently missed our targets." He didn't couch this question in softening language about challenges and learning opportunities.
He simply asked for an honest assessment of the situation. Jennifer's response revealed the depth of the problem.
Instead of providing a clear analysis of the strategic and tactical issues that had led to the product's failure, she launched into a lengthy explanation of circumstances beyond her control, resource constraints imposed by other departments, and market conditions that had made success difficult to achieve.
This response told Marcus everything he needed to know.
Jennifer was operating from sheep psychology, focused on explaining why success wasn't possible rather than identifying what actions could create success. She had internalized the failure as an identity rather than treating it as a problem to be solved. The conversation that followed was uncomfortable but necessary. Marcus explained that the turnaround would require a fundamental shift in how the team approached challenges. Instead of managing problems, they would need to solve them.
Instead of explaining limitations, they would need to create possibilities.
Instead of seeking consensus on every decision, they would need to execute rapidly based on clear strategic principles.
Some team members embraced this new approach with obvious relief.
They had been frustrated by the previous culture of endless meetings and consensus seeking that never led to decisive action. Others struggled with the increased accountability and clarity of expectations. Within 6 weeks, 3 of the original 8 team members had transferred to other departments, unable or unwilling to adapt to the new performance standards. Rather than seeing this as a failure of leadership or team cohesion, Marcus recognized it as a natural sorting process. The sheep would always seek environments where their comfort and security were prioritized over results. The wolves would thrive in situations that demanded excellence and rewarded achievement. By establishing clear expectations and maintaining them consistently, he had created conditions that attracted the kind of people who could contribute to success while encouraging those who couldn't to find better fits elsewhere. The remaining team members, supplemented by new hires selected specifically for their wolf characteristics, self-direction, results orientation, and comfort with ambiguity, began producing results that exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 4 months, the product line had returned to profitability. Within 8 months, it was exceeding its original performance projections. The success of this turnaround established Marcus as someone who could deliver results in challenging situations, but, more importantly, it confirmed his understanding of the fundamental differences between sheep and wolf psychology. The sheep sought security, predictability, and social approval. These were not inherently negative desires, but they were incompatible with the demands of leadership, innovation, and high performance in competitive environments. The wolves, by contrast, were motivated by challenge, growth, and the satisfaction of achieving objectives that others considered impossible. They were willing to sacrifice comfort and popularity in pursuit of excellence. They understood that the highest rewards, financial, professional, and personal, went to those who were willing to operate outside the comfortable boundaries that contained most people's ambitions. This realization led Marcus to a deeper question: if the wolf mindset was clearly superior in terms of producing results and creating opportunities, why did so few people adopt it? The answer lay in understanding the psychological foundations that kept most people trapped in sheep mentality, despite its obvious limitations. Fear was the primary mechanism. The sheep were terrified of rejection, failure, and isolation. These fears, while understandable from an evolutionary perspective, were largely obsolete in modern professional and personal contexts. The social rejection that might have meant death in prehistoric tribal settings was merely inconvenience in contemporary society. The failure that might have led to starvation for early humans was simply feedback in current business environments. But the emotional systems that had evolved to protect against these ancient threats continued to operate as if the stakes were life and death. This mismatch between evolutionary psychology and modern reality created the opportunity for those who could transcend their primitive fear responses to achieve disproportionate success. The wolf had learned to distinguish between real dangers and imaginary ones, between actual threats and the phantom menaces created by anxious minds. This clarity allowed for strategic risk-taking that appeared reckless to the sheep but was actually based on accurate assessment of probabilities and outcomes. Marcus's growing confidence in these principles led him to make increasingly bold moves in his professional life. When the opportunity arose to propose a completely new approach to client relations that would require significant upfront investment and challenge several established practices, he didn't seek approval through the usual channels of committee review and consensus building. Instead, he prepared a comprehensive presentation that laid out the strategic rationale, projected outcomes, and implementation plan, and requested a meeting with the executive team to present his proposal directly. This approach violated numerous unwritten rules about chain of command and collaborative decision-making, but it also demonstrated the kind of initiative and leadership that senior management claimed to value.
The presentation itself was a masterclass in wolf psychology applied to corporate influence.
Marcus didn't begin with humble apologies for taking up executive time or defensive explanations of why he felt qualified to make such a proposal.
He simply stated the opportunity he had identified and his recommended response to it.
The traditional approach to client relations in our industry assumes that customers know what they want and our job is to deliver it efficiently, he began. But our research indicates that our most valuable clients are actually looking for strategic partnership rather than order fulfillment. They want us to help them identify opportunities they haven't considered and solutions they wouldn't have developed internally. He paused to let this reframe settle before continuing. I'm proposing that we pilot a consultative relationship model with our top 10 clients over the next 6 months. Instead of responding to their requests, we proactively analyze their business challenges and present solutions that could create significant value for both organizations. The room was quiet as the executives processed this proposal.
Finally, CEO Patricia Zhao spoke. What kind of investment would this require, and what metrics would you use to measure success?
Marcus had anticipated these questions and provided detailed answers that demonstrated both the financial viability of the approach and his commitment to being held accountable for results. By the end of the 30-minute meeting, he had been authorized to proceed with the pilot program and given access to resources that typically required months of approval processes. This experience crystallized the final element of Marcus's transformation from sheep to wolf psychology. The most powerful advantage of the wolf mindset was not just individual effectiveness, but the ability to create value for others in ways they couldn't create for themselves. The sheep competed for scarce resources within existing systems. The wolves expanded the systems and created new resources for everyone to access. This distinction separated mere predatory behavior from true wolf leadership. The predator sought to take from others. The wolf sought to create more for everyone while ensuring his own position remained strong. This approach was ultimately more sustainable and more rewarding than zero-sum competition because it generated genuine loyalty and respect rather than mere compliance or fear. As Marcus reflected on the year of transformation he had undergone, he recognized that mastering the mind of the wolf was not about becoming aggressive, ruthless, or indifferent to others' welfare. It was about transcending the limitations that kept most people trapped in cycles of mediocrity and dependence. It was about developing the courage to pursue excellence even when that pursuit required abandoning the comfortable consensus of the herd. The sheep would always seek leaders who made them feel safe and validated. The wolves understood that true leadership required helping others become more capable, more confident, and more able to create value for themselves and their communities. This was the foundation upon which real power was built, not the temporary authority that came from position or manipulation, but the lasting influence that came from consistently producing results that benefited everyone involved. But this transformation was only the beginning. Having discovered the principles that separated wolves from sheep, Marcus now faced the more challenging task of applying these insights to completely rebuild his approach to personal relationships, financial independence, and long-term success. The corporate world had been his laboratory for understanding power dynamics, but the real test would come in creating a life that embodied wolf psychology in every dimension. Part 2, The Architecture of Dominance. The transformation from sheep to wolf psychology revealed itself most clearly not in moments of dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet accumulation of small victories that compounded into unstoppable momentum. Marcus discovered this principle on a cold Thursday evening in March, as he sat in his downtown apartment reviewing the financial statements that would reshape his entire approach to wealth building and personal freedom. For most of his adult life, Marcus had followed the conventional wisdom about personal finance that kept the majority of people trapped in cycles of dependency and limitation. He had dutifully contributed to his 401k, maintained a reasonable emergency fund, and avoided excessive debt while waiting for annual salary increases and periodic promotions to gradually improve his circumstances.
This approach, while financially responsible, was fundamentally based on sheep psychology, the belief that security came from following established patterns rather than creating new possibilities. The wolf mindset demanded a completely different framework for thinking about money, opportunity, and risk. Instead of viewing his career as a linear progression up predetermined corporate ladders, Marcus began to see it as a platform for developing skills, relationships, and market knowledge that could be leveraged into multiple income streams and, eventually, complete financial independence. This shift in perspective led him to analyze his current situation with the same strategic clarity he had applied to the failing product line at Meridian Industries. His salary, while comfortable, represented the smallest possible return on his time and expertise that his employer could offer while still retaining his services. Every hour he worked for someone else's vision was an hour not invested in building his own assets and opportunities. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberation came from understanding that he was not dependent on any single employer or industry for his future prosperity. Terror came from recognizing that this independence would require abandoning the psychological safety net of guaranteed employment and predictable income that kept most people trapped in economic mediocrity. Marcus's first step toward financial wolf psychology was to conduct a comprehensive audit of his skills, relationships, and market position. Unlike the sheep, who viewed their capabilities only in terms of their current job descriptions, he evaluated his potential value across multiple contexts and industries. His expertise in product development and turnaround management was clearly transferable to consulting work. His growing reputation for delivering results in challenging situations had created a network of contacts who regularly faced similar problems in their own organizations. His understanding of corporate dynamics and decision-making processes gave him insight into how businesses actually operated versus how they claimed to operate. But, most importantly, his transformation to wolf psychology had given him something that couldn't be taught or replicated: the confidence to propose solutions that others considered impossible and the persistence to implement them despite skepticism and resistance. Armed with this assessment, Marcus began systematically building what he came to think of as his independence infrastructure. While maintaining his performance at Meridian Industries and continuing to use his corporate position as a laboratory for testing influence strategies, he quietly began developing multiple alternative revenue streams that could eventually replace his salary entirely. The first opportunity arose from a conversation with Rachel Morrison, the CEO of a mid-sized manufacturing company who had heard about the product line turnaround through their mutual contact at an industry association. Rachel's company was struggling with operational inefficiencies that were eroding their profit margins and threatening their competitive position. "I've heard you have a talent for fixing broken systems," she said during a lunch meeting that Marcus had suggested when she mentioned her challenges in passing. "Would you be willing to take a look at our operation and give me your honest assessment?" Instead of immediately agreeing or launching into a detailed discussion of his qualifications, Marcus applied a fundamental principle of wolf psychology. He created scarcity around his expertise. "I'd be happy to take a look," he said, "but I should mention that I'm very selective about the consulting projects I take on. I only work with leaders who are genuinely committed to implementing necessary changes, even when they're difficult or unpopular." This response accomplished several objectives simultaneously. It positioned his expertise as valuable and limited rather than desperate and available. It pre-qualified Rachel as someone who was serious about solutions rather than just seeking validation for existing approaches. And it established the frame that he would be the expert consultant making recommendations rather than a supplicant hoping to be hired. Rachel's immediate response confirmed that this approach was effective. "That's exactly the kind of perspective we need," she said. "Too many consultants tell us what we want to hear instead of what we need to know. When can you start?" The consulting engagement that followed became a template for how Marcus would structure all of his independent work. Rather than charging hourly rates or accepting vaguely defined scope agreements that could expand indefinitely without corresponding increases in compensation, he proposed a results-based partnership model. "I'll conduct a 2-week diagnostic assessment of your operations at no charge," he told Rachel. "At the end of that period, I'll present you with a detailed analysis of the issues I've identified and a specific plan for addressing them. If you decide to move forward with implementation, my fee will be structured as a percentage of the measurable improvements we achieve over the following 6 months." This approach violated every norm of traditional consulting relationships, but it embodied pure wolf psychology. Instead of seeking security through guaranteed payment regardless of results, Marcus aligned his compensation directly with the value he created for the client. This structure gave him tremendous incentive to deliver exceptional outcomes while simultaneously demonstrating his confidence in his abilities. The diagnostic assessment revealed problems that went far deeper than the operational inefficiencies Rachel had initially described. The company's challenges were systemic, rooted in leadership approaches and cultural patterns that had been established over decades of sheep psychology management. Department heads protected their territories rather than collaborating to optimize overall company performance. Middle managers spent more time managing up, seeking approval and avoiding blame, than managing down to develop their team's capabilities. Frontline employees had learned that initiative was discouraged and that their job security depended on avoiding mistakes rather than creating improvements. Marcus's recommendations were comprehensive and radical. He proposed restructuring reporting relationships to eliminate redundant approval processes, implementing performance metrics that measured results rather than activities, and establishing clear accountability for outcomes at every level of the organization. But, most importantly, he recommended that Rachel herself transform her leadership approach from sheep to wolf psychology. Instead of trying to maintain harmony and avoid conflict, she would need to embrace the discomfort that came with holding people accountable for results. Instead of seeking consensus on every decision, she would need to make clear choices and communicate them with confidence. Instead of hoping that problems would resolve themselves, she would need to address issues directly and quickly. The implementation of these changes was not smooth. Several long-term employees who had thrived under the previous system of low accountability and unclear expectations struggled to adapt to the new performance standards. 2 department heads resigned rather than accept responsibility for measurable outcomes. The company's informal culture of complaint and excuse-making clashed dramatically with the new emphasis on solutions and results. But, within 3 months, the improvements were undeniable. Production efficiency increased by 23%, customer satisfaction scores reached their highest levels in company history, and employee turnover actually decreased as the remaining staff began to experience the satisfaction that came from working in a high-performance environment rather than a comfortable but mediocre one. Marcus's percentage-based compensation from this engagement exceeded what he would have earned from 6 months of traditional consulting fees, but, more importantly, it established a model that he could replicate with other clients while building a reputation as someone who delivered transformational results rather than incremental improvements. Word of his success with Rachel's company spread through the network of business leaders who faced similar challenges. Within 8 months, Marcus was managing 3 concurrent consulting engagements and had a waiting list of potential clients who wanted to work with him. This success created a new problem: how to scale his impact without falling into the trap of trading time for money at increasingly higher rates. The sheep approach would have been to hire additional consultants and build a traditional consulting firm. But Marcus recognized that this model would eventually limit his freedom and require him to spend more time managing employees than creating value for clients. Instead, he developed what he called the wolf multiplication strategy. Rather than delivering all services personally, he began identifying and training other professionals who could implement his methodologies under his oversight. This approach allowed him to maintain quality control and client relationships while expanding his capacity to serve more organizations simultaneously. The key to this model was selecting partners who already possessed wolf psychology characteristics or demonstrated the ability to develop them quickly. Marcus learned to identify these individuals through their responses to challenging situations, their willingness to take responsibility for outcomes, and their comfort with ambiguity and change. Sarah Kim, a project manager from his former department at Meridian Industries, was one of the first people he recruited to this network. She had consistently demonstrated the ability to deliver results in difficult circumstances and had expressed frustration with the limitations of corporate employment. When Marcus offered her the opportunity to lead implementation projects for his consulting clients, she immediately recognized the potential for both professional growth and financial independence. "This is exactly what I've been looking for," she told him during their initial planning meeting. "I'm tired of having good ideas that get lost in committee discussions and political considerations. I want to work with clients who are serious about getting results."
Sarah's success with her first independent project confirmed Marcus's ability to identify and develop other wolf psychology professionals. Her combination of technical expertise and implementation focus produced outcomes that exceeded client expectations while generating revenue that was multiples of her former corporate salary. This experience led Marcus to a profound realization about the nature of wealth creation and power accumulation. The sheep focused on competing for existing resources within established systems. They sought promotions, raises, and benefits that were determined by others and limited by organizational structures and policies. The wolves created new resources by developing capabilities that solved problems others couldn't address. They built networks of relationships based on mutual value creation rather than hierarchical authority. Most importantly, they designed revenue models that scaled with impact rather than time, allowing for exponential growth rather than linear progression. This distinction became even clearer as Marcus's consulting practice evolved into a more comprehensive approach to organizational transformation. Instead of focusing solely on operational improvements, he began helping clients develop their own wolf psychology leadership capabilities, creating sustainable change that didn't depend on his ongoing involvement. The program he developed combined strategic consulting with leadership development, teaching executives and managers how to think and operate from wolf psychology principles rather than just implementing specific tactical improvements. This approach created deeper, more lasting transformation while establishing Marcus as someone who could develop leaders rather than just solve problems. Jennifer Walsh, one of his former colleagues from Meridian Industries who had become CEO of a growing technology company, became one of the first clients for this expanded service offering. Her company was facing the challenges that many successful organizations encounter when they grow beyond the size where informal relationships and ad hoc processes can maintain effectiveness. "We've been successful because we have great people and good intentions," she told Marcus during their initial strategic session. "But we're starting to realize that those aren't enough anymore. We need systems and leadership approaches that can scale with our growth." Marcus's analysis revealed that Jennifer's company was experiencing classic sheep psychology scaling problems. Decision-making was slow because too many people were involved in every choice. Accountability was diffuse because responsibilities were shared rather than clearly assigned. Innovation was declining because the culture prioritized consensus and harmony over experimentation and risk-taking. The solution required transforming the company's entire approach to leadership, structure, and performance management. But, unlike his previous engagements that focused primarily on operational changes, this project required developing wolf psychology capabilities throughout the leadership team. Marcus designed a 6-month transformation program that combined organizational restructuring with intensive leadership development. Each member of the executive team would learn to operate from wolf psychology principles while implementing specific changes in their areas of responsibility. The program began with what Marcus called the reality assessment process. Each leader had to honestly evaluate their current effectiveness, identify the sheep psychology patterns that were limiting their impact, and commit to developing specific wolf psychology capabilities over the following 6 months. This process was uncomfortable for several executives who had built their careers on being collaborative, diplomatic, and consensus-oriented. The shift to direct communication, clear accountability, and results-focused decision-making required abandoning many of the behavioral patterns that had defined their professional identities. But the results were transformational. As each leader developed greater clarity about their objectives and increased confidence in their decision-making, the entire organization became more focused and effective. Projects that had previously required months of discussion and approval were completed in weeks. Innovation increased as teams felt empowered to experiment and learn from failures rather than avoiding any risk of making mistakes. Most importantly, employee satisfaction actually improved despite the increased performance expectations. People thrived in an environment where they knew what was expected, received clear feedback, and could see the direct connection between their contributions and the company's success. This engagement established Marcus as someone who could transform entire organizations rather than just solving specific problems. The financial returns from this type of comprehensive consulting were exponentially higher than project-based work, but the more significant benefit was the reputation it created for producing results that other consultants couldn't achieve. As his consulting practice grew and evolved, Marcus began to understand the deeper principles that separated wealth creation from income generation. The sheep earned money by trading their time and effort for predetermined compensation within systems controlled by others. Their income was always limited by the hours they could work and the rates that others were willing to pay. The wolves created wealth by developing assets that generated value independently of their direct time investment. These assets took many forms: expertise that could be systematized and scaled, relationships that created ongoing opportunities, intellectual property that could be licensed or franchised, and investment positions that appreciated over time. Marcus's consulting practice had become such an asset. His methodologies could be taught to other professionals, his client relationships generated referrals and repeat business, and his reputation created demand that exceeded his personal capacity to deliver services. This combination allowed him to maintain high profit margins while building a business that could eventually operate without his day-to-day involvement. But he also recognized that true financial independence required diversifying beyond service-based income into investment returns and passive revenue streams. The wealth he was generating from consulting needed to be systematically invested in assets that would continue growing regardless of his ongoing work efforts. This realization led him to apply wolf psychology principles to investment strategy, approaching financial markets with the same analytical rigor and strategic thinking he brought to organizational consulting. Instead of following conventional wisdom about diversified portfolios and conservative risk management, he focused on identifying undervalued assets and emerging opportunities where his expertise and network could provide advantages over other investors. The real estate market provided his first major opportunity to apply these principles. Through his consulting work, Marcus had developed deep knowledge of which geographic areas and industry sectors were positioned for growth based on the organizational changes he was helping companies implement. When one of his clients mentioned plans to relocate their headquarters to a developing commercial district that was currently undervalued, Marcus recognized the investment opportunity this represented. Rather than simply filing away this information, he immediately began researching property values, development plans, and infrastructure investments in the area. Within 6 weeks, he had purchased 3 commercial properties in the district at prices that reflected current conditions rather than the future value that would be created by his client's relocation, and the other developments he knew were planned for the area. This investment strategy was fundamentally different from the sheep approach of buying diversified index funds and hoping for average market returns over long time periods. Marcus was using his specialized knowledge and network to identify specific opportunities where he could achieve above-average returns through superior information and strategic timing. The success of these real estate investments confirmed that wolf psychology principles could be applied to wealth building across multiple domains. The key was to focus on opportunities where knowledge, relationships, and strategic thinking could create sustainable advantages rather than relying on luck or market timing. As Marcus's net worth grew and his financial independence became more achievable, he began to understand the final element of wolf psychology that separated true power from mere success: the ability to operate from abundance rather than scarcity, to create value for others without depleting his own resources, and to build influence that was based on mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. This evolution in his thinking would become the foundation for the third phase of his transformation, moving beyond personal success to creating systems and relationships that could generate lasting impact while providing the ultimate form of security: the knowledge that his value to others was so great that his prosperity was genuinely aligned with their success. The man who had once been trapped in the comfortable mediocrity of sheep psychology had discovered not just how to achieve financial independence, but how to build power that was sustainable precisely because it served others' interests as well as his own. But the ultimate test of these principles would come in applying them to the most challenging arena of all: personal relationships and the creation of a life that embodied wolf psychology in every dimension. Part 3, The Sovereign Path. The mastery of wolf psychology revealed its ultimate form not in the accumulation of wealth or professional achievement, but in the construction of a life that operated entirely on principles of sovereignty, value creation, and strategic relationships. Marcus discovered this truth on a quiet Sunday morning in September, as he reviewed the transformation that had occurred over the past 18 months and planned the next phase of his evolution from successful individual to architect of influence. The financial independence he had achieved through his consulting practice and strategic investments had provided more than just security. It had granted him the rarest of luxuries in modern society: complete freedom to choose how he spent his time, energy, and attention. No longer bound by the necessity of earning a paycheck or seeking approval from superiors, he could evaluate every opportunity and relationship based solely on its potential to create mutual value and advance his long-term objectives. This freedom revealed the final limitations that had to be transcended to fully embody wolf psychology. The sheep were trapped not just by external circumstances, but by internal patterns of thinking and feeling that made them dependent on others for validation, direction, and emotional stability. Even successful sheep remained vulnerable to manipulation, distraction, and self-sabotage because they had never learned to generate their own sense of worth and purpose independent of external feedback. The wolf's ultimate achievement was psychological sovereignty, the ability to maintain clarity, focus, and emotional equilibrium regardless of external circumstances or other people's reactions. This sovereignty wasn't built through isolation or indifference to others, but through developing such strong internal foundations that relationships could be based on choice rather than need, contribution rather than extraction, and mutual growth rather than dependency. Marcus began applying these principles to his personal relationships with the same systematic approach he had used to transform his professional life. He conducted what he privately called a relationship audit, evaluating each significant connection in his life based on whether it was characterized by mutual value creation, authentic communication, and genuine respect for each person's individual goals and boundaries. The results of this analysis were sobering. Many of his long-standing friendships were based on shared complaints about life circumstances rather than shared vision for improvement. His dating relationships had been characterized by accommodation and approval-seeking rather than authentic self-expression and mutual challenge. Even his family relationships often involved patterns of guilt, obligation, and subtle manipulation rather than honest communication and supportive accountability. This recognition didn't lead to wholesale abandonment of existing relationships, but it did require a fundamental shift in how Marcus approached every interaction. Instead of automatically adapting his behavior to others' expectations or trying to maintain harmony at the expense of honesty, he began operating from his authentic values and allowing others to respond however they chose. The transformation was immediately apparent in his dating life. Previously, Marcus had approached romantic relationships from sheep psychology, seeking to be chosen, approved of, and accepted by women who met his criteria for attractiveness and compatibility. This approach had led to a series of relationships that began with mutual attraction but gradually devolved into patterns of compromise, resentment, and eventual dissolution as both parties became increasingly inauthentic versions of themselves. The wolf psychology approach to romantic relationships was fundamentally different. Instead of seeking to be chosen, Marcus focused on choosing. Instead of trying to become what he thought women wanted, he became more fully himself and attracted partners who were genuinely compatible with his authentic personality and values. Instead of avoiding conflict or difficult conversations, he addressed issues directly while maintaining respect for both his own and his partner's autonomy. This shift became evident during his first date with Elena Rodriguez, a successful architect he had met through his professional network. Previous Marcus would have spent the evening trying to impress her with carefully curated stories and opinions designed to maximize her approval. Wolf psychology Marcus simply engaged in honest conversation about topics that genuinely interested him, shared his authentic perspectives on questions she asked, and evaluated whether their interaction created the kind of mutual energy that indicated genuine compatibility. "I have to say," Elena told him as they walked to their cars after dinner, "this is the first date I've been on in months where I felt like I was talking to an actual person instead of someone's idea of what a good date should be." Her observation confirmed that authenticity was far more attractive than performance, especially when that authenticity included rough edges and unpopular opinions. The relationship that developed with Elena became a laboratory for applying wolf psychology principles to intimate partnership. Instead of gradually merging their identities and compromising their individual goals for the sake of togetherness, they maintained clear boundaries around their personal aspirations while finding ways to support each other's growth and success. When Elena was offered a prestigious project that would require her to travel frequently for 6 months, previous Marcus would have either discouraged the opportunity out of insecurity or agreed to it with hidden resentment. Wolf psychology. Marcus recognized that her professional success contributed to her overall fulfillment and attractiveness as a partner, and that his security in the relationship should be based on their mutual choice to be together rather than external circumstances that limited other options. "This sounds like an incredible opportunity," he told her when she explained the project and her concerns about how the travel might affect their relationship. "I think you should absolutely do it. We're both successful adults with full lives. We can handle 6 months of long-distance dating if we decide it's worth it." His response eliminated Elena's internal conflict about choosing between her career and their relationship, while also demonstrating that he valued her individual success as much as their partnership. The project became a source of excitement and growth for both of them rather than stress and compromise. This approach to relationship dynamics extended beyond romantic partnerships to friendships, family relationships, and professional collaborations. Marcus learned to identify and eliminate what he called energy drain relationships, connections that were characterized by chronic complaining, emotional vampirism, or subtle attempts to undermine his confidence and success. His college friend Kevin exemplified this pattern. Their friendship had been built around shared struggles and mutual support during difficult times in their 20s, but, as Marcus's circumstances improved, Kevin became increasingly negative and critical about his success. Instead of celebrating achievements or offering encouragement for new ventures, Kevin consistently responded with warnings about potential failures, comments about how success might change Marcus's personality, or subtle implications that his progress was somehow unfair or undeserved. The sheep psychology response would have been to minimize his own success to avoid threatening the friendship, or to invest extra time and energy trying to help Kevin develop a more positive mindset. Wolf psychology required recognizing that Kevin's negativity was a choice that served his own psychological needs, and that no amount of accommodation or assistance would change this pattern unless Kevin decided to change it himself. Marcus didn't dramatically confront Kevin or announce the end of their friendship. He simply stopped investing emotional energy in trying to maintain a connection that had become toxic to his own growth and well-being. He responded politely to Kevin's messages but stopped initiating contact, declined invitations to social events that would involve extended exposure to negative energy, and redirected conversations away from complaining and toward constructive topics when they did interact. This approach allowed the friendship to fade naturally without creating unnecessary drama or conflict. Kevin eventually reduced his contact as he realized that Marcus was no longer available as an audience for his grievances, and both men were able to move forward without the resentment that would have been created by a more confrontational approach. The same principles applied to family relationships, where sheep psychology often created lifelong patterns of guilt, obligation, and emotional manipulation. Marcus's relationship with his mother had been characterized by subtle but persistent attempts to control his choices through expressions of worry, disappointment, or disapproval whenever he made decisions that didn't align with her preferences. When he decided to leave his corporate position to focus entirely on his consulting practice, her response was predictably negative. "I just don't understand why you're giving up a good job with security and benefits to chase some uncertain business venture," she said during their weekly phone call. "What happens if this consulting thing doesn't work out?" Previous Marcus would have spent considerable time and energy trying to convince her that his decision was sound, providing detailed explanations of his financial projections and business strategy while seeking her approval and support. Wolf psychology. Marcus recognized that her concerns were based on her own fears and limitations rather than objective assessment of his situation, and that seeking her approval would only reinforce her belief that she should have input on his life choices. "I understand your concerns, Mom," he replied calmly, "and I appreciate that they come from love and wanting me to be secure. I've done my research and I'm confident in my decision. I'm hoping you'll support me, but I also understand if this isn't the choice you would make." This response acknowledged her feelings without seeking her permission or approval, while also making it clear that his decision was final regardless of her reaction. Over time, as his consulting practice proved successful and he demonstrated that he could make good choices for himself, their relationship improved because she learned that her attempts to influence his decisions were ineffective and unnecessary. The transformation in his personal relationships created a social circle that was characterized by mutual respect, authentic communication, and shared commitment to individual growth and success. These relationships required less maintenance and provided more satisfaction because they were based on genuine compatibility and choice rather than obligation or compromise. But the ultimate expression of wolf psychology sovereignty came through Marcus's evolution from successful individual to creator of systems and opportunities that benefited entire communities of people. Having achieved financial independence and personal fulfillment, he began to understand that the highest level of power came not from accumulating resources for himself, but from building platforms that could generate value for others while creating sustainable influence and impact. This realization led to the development of what Marcus called the Wolf Leadership Institute, a comprehensive program designed to teach wolf psychology principles to business leaders, entrepreneurs, and high-performing professionals who were trapped in sheep psychology patterns despite their apparent success. The institute combined the strategic consulting expertise Marcus had developed with systematic leadership development, investment education, and personal sovereignty training. Participants learned not just how to be more effective in their current roles, but how to build the psychological foundations and practical capabilities needed for complete independence and sustained success. The program attracted exactly the kind of people Marcus had hoped to reach: accomplished professionals who recognized that their current approaches to success were ultimately limited by sheep psychology assumptions about how power, wealth, and relationships worked. They were ready to embrace the discomfort of abandoning familiar patterns in exchange for the freedom and effectiveness that came with wolf psychology mastery. Sarah Kim, who had become one of his most successful consulting partners, was among the first graduates of the institute. Her transformation illustrated the program's potential to create multiplicative impact rather than just individual improvement. Before working with Marcus, she reflected during a testimonial interview, "I was successful by conventional standards, but I was constantly stressed about maintaining that success. I was dependent on my employer's decisions, worried about competition from colleagues, and exhausted from trying to manage everyone else's opinions and reactions." The Wolf Leadership Institute taught me how to build real security through capability and value creation rather than the false security that comes from following other people's rules and expectations. Sarah's success as an independent consultant and business owner created opportunities for dozens of other professionals in her network, established her as a recognized expert in organizational transformation, and generated financial returns that far exceeded what she could have achieved through traditional employment. But, more importantly, she had developed the psychological sovereignty that allowed her to operate from confidence and abundance rather than fear and scarcity. The Institute's graduates formed a powerful network of individuals who understood wolf psychology principles and could apply them across industries, geographic regions, and market conditions. This network created opportunities for collaboration, investment, and mutual support that were far more valuable than any individual could generate working alone. Marcus discovered that by teaching others to achieve the same transformation he had undergone, he was building influence that was both more sustainable and more rewarding than any form of positional authority or competitive advantage. The graduates of his program became advocates for its principles, ambassadors for his methods, and partners in creating additional value for new communities of people. This approach represented the ultimate evolution of wolf psychology, the recognition that true power came not from dominating others or hoarding resources, but from developing such valuable capabilities and creating such beneficial outcomes that others sought association and collaboration rather than having to be convinced or coerced. The Wolf Leadership Institute grew rapidly through referrals and word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied graduates. Within 2 years, Marcus was conducting programs for executives from Fortune 500 companies, successful entrepreneurs who wanted to scale their impact, and high-performing professionals who were ready to break free from the limitations of employee mindset. But the most significant measure of the Institute's success was not its financial returns or enrollment numbers, but the transformation it created in participants' lives and the ripple effects those transformations had on their families, organizations, and communities. Elena, who had initially been skeptical of what she called Marcus's alpha male philosophy, became one of the program's strongest advocates after seeing its effects on her own professional life and personal relationships. "I thought this was going to be about becoming more aggressive or competitive," she explained to a friend who was considering the program. "But it's actually about becoming more authentic and effective. It's about building the confidence to be yourself instead of trying to be what you think other people want." The Institute's influence extended beyond its direct participants to create cultural changes in the organizations where graduates worked and the industries they influenced. Companies that employed Wolf Leadership Institute graduates reported higher employee engagement, faster decision-making, increased innovation, and improved financial performance. These results attracted attention from business media and led to speaking opportunities that further expanded the program's reach and impact. Marcus's evolution from trapped corporate employee to sovereign creator of value had taken less than 3 years, but the principles he had developed were creating transformation that would continue for decades. The man who had once sought security through conformity and approval-seeking had discovered that true security came from developing capabilities that were so valuable to others that his success was genuinely aligned with their prosperity. As he reflected on this journey during a quiet evening in his home office, surrounded by the evidence of transformation, financial statements showing his investment portfolio, thank you letters from institute graduates, photographs from speaking engagements and consulting projects, Marcus understood that he had achieved something far more significant than personal success. He had proven that it was possible for anyone to transcend the limitations of sheep psychology and create a life of complete sovereignty, authentic relationships, and meaningful impact. The principles were accessible to anyone willing to abandon the comfortable consensus of the herd and embrace the challenging path of individual excellence and value creation. The Wolf psychology transformation was not about becoming predatory or indifferent to others' welfare. It was about developing such strong internal foundations and valuable external capabilities that relationships could be based on choice rather than need, contribution rather than extraction, and mutual growth rather than competition for scarce resources. This was the ultimate answer to the question that had begun his journey: how to become truly indestructible in a world that constantly threatened the security and autonomy of individuals who hadn't learned to generate their own power and create their own opportunities. The man who destroys his weak self, the self that seeks approval, avoids responsibility, and waits for others to create the conditions for his success, can never be destroyed by others because he has built his life on foundations that are internal rather than external, chosen rather than inherited, and constantly growing rather than slowly deteriorating. In a world of sheep who compete for the scraps of opportunity that others provide, the wolf creates abundance by developing capabilities that solve problems others cannot address, building relationships based on mutual value creation, and designing systems that generate prosperity for entire communities of people. This was not just a strategy for individual success, but a philosophy for creating the kind of society where excellence was rewarded, authenticity was valued, and individuals could achieve their full potential without diminishing others' opportunities for growth and fulfillment. The transformation was complete, but the impact was just beginning. Every person who learned to operate from wolf psychology principles became a catalyst for others' transformation, creating exponential effects that would continue long after the original catalyst had moved on to new challenges and opportunities. Marcus smiled as he closed his notebook and prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to create value, new people to influence positively, and new evidence that the man who had mastered his own mind could never be controlled by others' limitations or destroyed by external circumstances. In a world of sheep, he had indeed mastered the mind of the wolf, and, in doing so, had discovered that true predators were not those who took from others, but those who created so much value that everyone around them became more prosperous, more capable, and more free.